Welcome to Divorce Explained with myself, Leanne Townsend, and my colleague, Steve Benmor, who is a divorce strategist and family mediator at Benmor Family Law Group. Today, we have a topic that probably wouldn't have been as popular or as common a topic or question that we get asked as family law lawyers, and that's the topic of how to protect your assets before getting married. And why do I say that that's, it wasn't as common years ago? Well, in 2025, things are a lot different than they used to be years ago. For example, people are getting married later in life. The average age of for people getting married has gone up. And as a result of that, people are entering into marriages already having accumulated some assets, already having worked a number of years in their career, and they're earning a certain level of income and have certain assets that they're concerned about protecting when they get married. Also, with the high divorce rate that we have here in 2025, parties are marrying more times. Many years ago, my parents' generation, divorce was less common. People married once in their lifetime. Now, it's not uncommon for people not just to marry 2 times, but 3 times or 4 times. And so the issue of protecting assets has become even more important and something in people's minds when they're getting married. People have children from prior relationships, and they want to make sure that their money's going to flow to their children rather than maybe their 4th spouse and things like that. So these are all considerations that are coming up. And to complicate it even more, because of the cost of living, particularly in cities like Toronto, where Steve and I practice law, often parties need help from their parents to even be able to afford major purchases like a matrimonial home. And so parties' parents are contributing more money into what could be a family asset, and they're wanting to ensure that there's some level of protection for their money should the marriage not work out. So all of these things have made things more complicated in family law in 2025 or make it seem more complicated. But that's why people ask the question, how can they better protect their assets before getting married? So Steve, what's your response when someone says that to you? Because I'm sure you get lots of people coming through the door asking that very question.
Yeah, and it's a popular question in 2025 because people are far more knowledgeable today than they were in previous generations about almost everything, from medicine to healthcare to the legal issues that affect their lives. Everybody's got access to the internet. And more importantly, in pop culture, certainly, stories coming out of places like Hollywood, the story of divorce is something that people have been drawn to, hearing about these multi-million-dollar divorce settlements by wealthy people or by actors has also improved people's knowledge of the consequences of an ill-planned marriage. So let's talk about that in Ontario. If people marry or live together in Ontario, right away, there are different laws that apply to people that live together versus married. Now, if people marry and own assets, there are different laws that apply to them than if they don't own assets. And really, their issues pertain to children and to income. And so the area of law that affects separation and divorce, whether the people are married or unmarried, is complicated. And so for those people that choose to not plan, they then suffer the consequences of having to navigate through what is otherwise a very chaotic process leading to a settlement. When you overlay that with feelings of upset, distress, distrust, revenge, you have this horrible cocktail that's brewing that results in what we see quite often to be a high conflict separation or divorce, which generally costs people undue sums of money and tremendous aggravation, coupled with delay in being able to move on to the next chapter of their life. So along comes the notion of planning. And in the US, planning is often called a prenuptial agreement. In Canada, we still use the word prenuptial, but the actual legal words are a domestic contract. Part 4 of Ontario's Family Law Act defines domestic contracts as being either a separation agreement, of course, that applies to people that already split up, or a marriage contract, which applies to people that are about to get married, or a marriage contract after they get married, which is also considered a post-nuptial marriage contract. Then there's the cohabitation agreement, people that are not married, that don't plan on getting married, one day might get married, but right now are not getting married. They're just going to live together. And then there's the paternity agreement that deals with parents who are the parents of a child, and they want to have an agreement that sets out their rights and obligations. So in effect, Ontario's Family Law Act said, look, here are the laws that apply to people that are married or unmarried on issues such as property division and support. In Ontario, we have another set of laws called the Children's Law Reform Act that deals with parenting issues. In all of Canada, we have a national piece of legislation called the Divorce Act that deals with parenting and support. Doesn't deal with property. That's dealt with by the Provincial Act. And so the area of law in Canada and in Ontario sets out all these various laws. And when people split up without having planned, they then turn to a lawyer and go, okay, what are my rights and obligations? And that's where the lack of planning becomes very obvious, because if they had planned, they wouldn't be asking that question. They would be very limited with what the outcome would be. No different, by the way, than dying with a will versus dying without a will. Because if you die with a will, somebody reads the will upon death and says, this is what everybody gets. It's clear. If you die without a will, now you're falling into the hands of the legislation. And I've said this to people more than once, and fortunately my voice is now being heard more, and more people are getting prenups, marriage contracts, and cohabitation agreements. I say to them the following: if you start living together or get married without a domestic contract like a prenup, a marriage contract, or a cohabitation agreement, you are basically saying to the government of Ontario, government, you write me my prenup. You tell us when the day comes and we split up what I owe. But the government of Canada and the government of Ontario says, well, we'll give you some general guidelines, but at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of he says, she says, and a lot of dispute. Whereas instead of delegating the job of determining the prenup by the government, you actually sit down and write a prenup together, not the day before you get married, by the way, or the day you move in together, but months in advance. You are collaborating, you are sharing values, and you are establishing what might happen, what will happen if you split up. No different than when people buy car insurance, they don't intend to have a car accident. When people do a will, they don't intend to die. But what they're doing in those acts is they're acting responsibly, and they're making sure that they're not going to leave this tremendous area of conflict to be resolved later. You're resolving it now, you're putting it away, and now you can move on with your relationships with peace of mind. And remember, like a will, like life insurance, like car insurance, just because you sign that contract today doesn't mean you can't change it later. So a couple that's marrying today and signs a prenup today, they can renegotiate that prenup 5, 10, 25 years from now. And if one of them, for example, is getting $300,000 from their grandmother out of the will, and they want to use that money to buy a new home or to move up in their home, they can redo the prenup and therefore protect that money so that it's not shared unnecessarily by the wrong person when the time comes. So to bring it to a full circle, how do you protect your assets? The answer is plan. And the old saying goes, for those of you that fail to plan, you plan to fail. And nothing is smarter than starting a relationship, which is a very important part of everybody's life, finding someone you love and starting a relationship together and having children together. That's a great stage in life to be at, but it's also one that requires responsibility. And that responsibility involves planning and figuring out what would happen if one of us died prematurely? What would happen if one of us decided to end the relationship? And what would that mean for our assets and our income? Just as a side note, you cannot sign a prenup that sets out what will happen with the children. That is not acceptable for obvious reasons. You also cannot sign a prenup that is against public policy. But you can sign a prenup so long as there has been full disclosure, proper legal advice, and you could set out exactly what will happen should there be a breakup. You could also set up that there will be a review when certain events occur.
And a prenup or a marriage contract essentially becomes the separation agreement. If the parties should separate, then they're going to save themselves a lot of legal costs down the road, because the marriage contract will then, in essence, become what is the separation agreement. And one of the complaints that I sometimes hear about domestic contracts and including marriage contracts in particular, they're not romantic, or if my soon-to-be spouse loves me, then why would they make me sign this? And when I'm asked those questions, or in those things are said to me, I said, first of all, it has nothing to do with love. It's a completely separate issue. It's more like a business decision. And getting married, while it is about love and partnership and companionship and all those wonderful things, there is a business decision element to it. Your money is involved, property is involved, income is involved. You're building a life together that covers all of these areas. And so there is a business aspect to it. And commonly, if you went into some sort of partnership, like a business partnership with somebody, you would have documents that govern that relationship and what would happen if certain things happen. And so a marriage contract or a domestic contract is really no different. And I am seeing that it's become more and more common for parties to get these types of contracts done up. Probably a long time ago, it was more of a rarity. There, I see lots of people from all age groups, walks of life getting them. It's not just something I'm seeing with people who are middle-aged and having second or third marriages. I am seeing it also with younger couples going into a first marriage where one or both of them has some assets they want to protect, and it's just smart to do it. And if you're, sometimes it can, when you receive a contract like that, or a draft contract from your prospective partner, it can be telling, I suppose, in certain cases, in that I have seen some that are presented that are very coercive is that's a good word.
And I want to jump in and elaborate on that. Really good segue into this. A lot of people don't know this, but the discussion of a prenup is actually a fantastic way to learn about family values.
Yeah.
When you have to have a conversation with your fiance, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, whenever that conversation occurs, it does not have to be a discourteous one. It does not have to be a distrustful one. It's actually an opportunity to open up about family values. Now, it was common a long time ago for men to marry women and for women to go from being a daughter to being a wife. That was a family value in an earlier generation. In today's generation, in some cases, people marry where they want an equal. And one of the two might say, well, I was expecting when we get married for me to never work and for you to be the provider and for me to be at home with the children, which, by the way, could be either gender. And the reality is those are conversations that are so valuable early in the relationship to understand how do people have shared values and how do people have contrasting values. And those values ultimately are what inform the terms of a prenup. I'll tell you a story. A couple months ago, I was retained to negotiate a prenup, and I represented the woman, the female fiance. And I can tell you by way of spoiler alert that the process leading to the negotiation of the prenup led to them breaking up. Now, one would say, well, that's a horrible role that you played in that relationship. And I say, no. First of all, it wasn't my decision to either engage me or for the advice that I gave. But the point of it was the negotiation of the prenup caused both of them to realize they had very different values. And it was obvious that if they were to force a square peg into a circular hole for reasons that did not justify the relationship, but either because they loved traveling together, or they were very good as sexual partners, or their friends liked them to be together because they were out of the same friend circle. Those were all good reasons to marry, but at the end of the day, those were going to be the reasons that were not going to hold them together for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And the things that were going to break them apart is what came out during the discussion surrounding the prenup. And it became obvious to the two of them that their values were very different. And it just didn't make sense for them to continue in the relationship. And I credit that conversation, or those conversations that we had both collectively and individually, to being a valuable step in ascertaining whether the marriage itself, the cohabitation itself, is going to be a long-term, sustainable, healthy, and trusting relationship. And nothing outs that better than having a conversation about what would happen should we split up one day, or should one of us die prematurely. And so the prenup process, and by the way, I'm using the word prenup pluralistically to include marriage contracts, cohabitation agreements, postnups, prenups. I'm just using the word prenup to cover all of those. Those conversations are such valuable conversations. No different, by the way, than the conversation about how you want your estate to be handled should you die, and how should everything be distributed. These are deep, thoughtful, methodical conversations that should never be harried, never be rushed. It should always be ones that are based on a fulsome analysis of what your values are and what works for your family.
And they're conversations that you should be able to have with someone who you're going to marry or enter into a common law relationship with. So yes, can they be uncomfortable conversations? Sure. They're not easy conversations, but if you can't have a conversation with your partner about these topics without it ending in anger or an argument or disrespect and those sorts of things, then you really need to take a long, hard look at your relationship, because these are topics you should be able to talk about.
A last point I want to make before we wrap up is that a lot of people think that a prenup is for people who are wealthy, and it's for people where there is a very large disparity in net worth. Both statements are not true. Prenups are very common for the average Joe, people that are starting their lives together, that have modest careers, possibly no assets, because it actually foreshadows a possible ending of the relationship. And statistically speaking, relationships end at a rate of about 50%. And so the idea that a prenup is only for the wealthy is just simply not true. It's for everybody. And the other one is that the illusion that prenups are only where there's a mammoth net worth disparity, also not true. The prenup itself might involve two people that have different financial positions, but the actual terms of the prenup may not necessarily mean that the person that is financially stronger keeps everything and the person that's financially weaker gets nothing. It could actually properly provide for a very appropriate, respectful, soft landing at the end of a relationship. And more importantly, prenups work very well together with wills, because if somebody gets married and they already have children, they certainly don't want at their death for their children and their spouse to have a contest over how to divide the assets later. And so a prenup goes very well with a will, particularly for people that start relationships when they already have children or other dependents. So at the end of the day, prenups, marriage contracts, and cohabitation agreements are a common tool these days to responsibly plan and to avoid future unnecessary conflict, and definitely avoid the unnecessary cost of lawyers and debates should a relationship end either by way of separation or death. So that's it for the subject of how to protect your assets when you get married or start a relationship. And if you have any questions about this, you're more than welcome to schedule an appointment with Leanne or I to discuss how to properly plan for your future loving relationship.